Good afternoon. Noah Kaiser here. Some of you know me, some of you don't. After our conversation on Facebook last night as a league, I felt like there was a need to address some misconceptions about trades and about the value of players when we're going to trade them. So, taking it upon myself, create this little tutorial of a video. I hope that it's helpful for you. Okay, first, this is something we all do in our heads. We all value individual players, not just based on how good they are by position, but how good they are for us, for our team. We have to remember that as we're discussing trades and discussing players. It's not necessarily how good they are compared to other players within their position, but how good are they for our team, right? It's not always their position versus another position or them against another player. It's what do they bring for us? How much value do they bring to our team as a whole in their production? Right? So we need to analyze that. Last night we were talking a lot about, well, Tony Gonzalez is the number 2 tight end and Torrey Smith is number 14 wide receiver. Well, those are rankings within their own positions, and that's kind of like apples and oranges. We need to see what is their value for any given team. What is their value for the team of Philip and the team of Jacob, who are the managers who have those particular players. Because having the number 2 wide receiver versus the number 2 tight end means that you have Victor Cruz versus Tony Gonzalez, and that's actually a different valuation for your team to the tune of 35 points, right? Victor Cruz in our league has already put up 101 points this season, whereas the number 2 tight end, Tony Gonzalez, only 66, which means your team has got more value out of the number 2 wide receiver than you would get out of the number 2 tight end. And we all know that, and that's why you wouldn't trade Victor Cruz for Tony Gonzalez, because you need his production, right? If you have the number 2 quarterback, you don't trade him for the number 2 tight end, because that's Aaron Rodgers, who's put up 155 points versus the 66 points of the number 2 tight end, which is Gonzalez. So we understand functionally that there's a different value. We do. We operate that way when we draft. We operate that way when we are working the waiver wire. We operate that way when we're analyzing trades for our team. But we lost sight of it last night when we were analyzing somebody else's trade, right? So let's just keep that in mind. And to that point, I want us to discuss these two teams, using this as like a case study for value for a team. Was one team... well, essentially, some of the assumptions were that Philip was giving up too much and not getting enough in the trade. That was the assumption, that it wasn't a fair trade. Well, let's look at that, all right? And we can't just go by one's a number 2 tight end and one is a number 14 wide receiver, because it doesn't really work that way. If you look at the wide receivers that Jacob has versus the wide receivers that Philip has one of the weaker cores of wide receivers in our entire league, right? He has Jordy Nelson, who's a number 5. This is Philip's team. Jordy Nelson, great, number 5. The next wide receiver he has is number 38, Jeremy Maclin, in production thus far this season. And then it's 42, 69, and 71. He has Gibson, Garcon, and Young. He has a terrible wide receiving core. There's only 10 teams in our league, so theoretically, if it's all worked out the way we thought it would at the draft, we should not be playing any of the wide receivers that are below the 30, ranked 30th, unless, they're really, that a stud that's just really struggling. Maybe you keep playing them because you believe in them psychologically. But technically, based entirely on stats, you don't think you're going to be going much below 30. And the number 2 wide receiver that Philip has is the 38th overall. That's just terrible. He needs help at wide receiver. He has to do something. He has to leverage a strength in his team to address this weakness that he has, and wide receiver is his weakness. Then you look at Jacob's team. His top 5 wide receivers, he has number 6, which is Brandon Marshall. Great. Then he has 13, 14, 16, and 23. He has Andre Roberts, Torrey Smith, Calvin Johnson, and Dwayne Bowe. All 5 of his wide receivers here are within the top 30 in point production. So this is a strength in his team. He has the ability to trade away someone who's valuable because he has value on his bench that he can supplement with, right? That makes sense to us. We understand that, right? Well, the difference in the top 3 wide receivers in our league can play 2 or 3. Let's say you just look at your top 3 in production on the year. The top 3 for Jacob, Marshall, Roberts, and Smith have totaled 210 points, for a team. Whereas Nelson, Maclin, and Gibson have totaled 170. That's a different valuation of 40 points on the year. Jacob's team has gotten from his top 3 40 more points towards his team's total score than Philip could from his top 3. And that's assuming they played those top 3. Maybe they didn't, but we're just going on the valuation that they bring to the team hypothetically. So there's 40 extra points of value on the top 3 of Jacob versus top 3 of Philip. Philip wants some of that, obviously. Well, so Philip does something about it. But to get Torrey Smith, so understand this, if Philip gets the valuation of Torrey Smith, and we're assuming that's going to project how Smith is going to produce just like how Gonzalez is going to produce in the future. And all we can do is go off the stats that we have thus far. And we understand that Torrey Smith is a feast or famine guy. You decide whether or not you want to go for that. If you want to trade for that, then you take the risk with it. But there's nothing unfair about trading for a guy who's feast or famine. There's plenty of those guys in the league. So he decides he's going to go after Torrey Smith. Looking at the valuation of Torrey Smith thus far for a team, if he had added him, if Philip had had him from week 1, he would have 20 extra points on his team. 20 extra points. That would put him at his number 2 wide receiver, not number 3, but his number 2 wide receiver on his team, right? So he takes that 40 points that were between he and Jacob at that point, and there's more than that between some of the other guys, and he cuts it in half by 20 points, right? More than in half, because some of those points are going away from Jacob by giving up a valuable wide receiver. So by taking on that, you have to understand, by taking on Torrey Smith, Philip is essentially getting 20 points of value thus far in the season, assuming those 20 points are going to project into the future. But he has to give something up to get them. He has to give up Gonzalez. Gonzalez is the number 2 tight end, which means he's had good production for a tight end. He also has, Vernon Davis. So if he falls back to Vernon Davis because he has to give up the number 2 tight end, what does he take? What kind of hit does he take? Well, to lose Gonzalez, Philip takes an 11-point hit. It's like a negative 11 in his valuation. To have Torrey Smith positive 20, he has to give up Gonzalez negative 11, which means he comes out with a net of 9 points on the year. Right? 9 points thus far in the year had he made that swap at the very beginning, which is how we're, looking ahead. It's how you have to value those trades going forward if you take out all the psychological components just based on stats. So he has a potential in that trade, he's going to get +9. +9, that's great. Good. Doesn't sound huge, but it's fine. Look at what happens to Jacob if he goes through with this same trade. He gives up Torrey Smith, who's his number 3 wide receiver, to get the number 2 tight end. That makes us think, well, that seems odd because he's number 14 overall and he's not even, yada, yada, yada. I don't like it, blah, blah, blah. Well, essentially, the loss of Torrey Smith is a hit on his team of -2 because you drop down to Calvin Johnson, who's had not as good a year, but technically he's only 2 points off of Torrey Smith. So as far as valuation thus far in the season, Jacob takes a -2 hit to get, Tony Gonzalez. Well, the thing is, Jacob already has Owen Daniels, the number 3 tight end. So the valuation that he's getting from Tony Gonzalez is that he's actually only getting a +5. There's 5 points that have separated Tony Gonzalez from Owen Daniels thus far. So his team's only getting 5 extra valuation points at that position and overall, which means he's only getting a negative of +3. He's getting a 3-point valuation boost at this point in the season by trading away Torrey Smith to get Tony Gonzalez, which means in this trade, the team that gets the higher valuation is Philip. He gets 3 times the valuation boost based off of this trade as opposed to Jacob. That's how you have to look at it. You have to look at what does it do for the team overall. And even though it's the number 14 overall wide receiver and the number 2 tight end, the team that benefits the most, if that valuation continues in its proper trajectory based on statistics, is actually Phillips by 3 times as much. All right. So that should help us understand this is not an unfair trade. It's a risky trade for Philip, because Torrey Smith is a feast or famine guy. Some of us love him, some of us hate him. It's a interesting trade for Jacob because he'll have to decide who am I going to play, Owen Daniels or am I going to play Tony Gonzalez, which means that one of these guys is going to win in the trade because one of them is probably going to come out ahead because you don't make a trade that's lateral. That doesn't help your team. You want your team to benefit from the trade, right? So one of these teams is probably going to benefit. Hindsight will be 20/20 on that. We don't know which one will benefit more. But that doesn't make it unfair that one team benefits and the other team doesn't end up benefiting as much or at all. That's just part of the game. That's just part of trading. But right now, based strictly on the stats, 3-point boost in valuation for Jacob, 9-point boost for Philip, which means this is not an unfair trade. Both teams are bettering themselves through the trade, and it actually looks like Philip's bettering his team by more. So think about that as you think about trades. Think about that as you analyze trades, trade offers that come across your desk, and realize that as we discuss trades, we've got to break this mentality of let me look at where they're ranked by position and start thinking in terms of total value for a team, given the weaknesses and the strengths of that team. I hope that's helpful. If it wasn't, it was very enjoyable for me to make this video. Some of you haven't finished watching it. Some of you stopped at the 3-minute point. Some of you are going to tell me that you stopped at the 3-minute point, even though you watched the whole thing, Josh Evans, just to try and get under my skin, and that will probably hurt me because I won't know for certain if you've truly watched the whole thing. I hope that you do because I've really poured my fantasy football soul out into this video. So I don't know if this is the first of many or if this is just one video. I don't know. I don't know how much love I have to share with my fantasy football comrades. I also don't want to give away too many of my brilliant insights. So consider this a token, a freebie. The next one might not be. I'm going to beat you all.